Welcome. Tonight, we undertake a special kind of voyage. We will venture deep into one of history's most profound and somber epochs, a time of great shadow and change. Our destination is the age of the Black Death, but our goal tonight isn't simply to recount historical facts or list dates and figures from the past. Instead, we want to truly imagine the reality of that time, to feel what it might have been like to survive such a devastating and world-altering pandemic. This narrative is dedicated entirely to the perspective of the survivors, the people who endured, who navigated a world consumed by pestilence and unimaginable loss. These were the people who stepped out from the darkness of that age into a future that was completely and unimaginably different from the world they had known. It is, of course, a story of immense loss, but more than that, it is a powerful testament to the incredible resilience that truly defines the human experience. Before our journey truly begins, I'd like to extend an invitation to connect with our growing community of history enthusiasts. If this exploration resonates with you, please consider showing your support by liking and subscribing. More than that, I would be genuinely delighted to hear from you. Leave a comment to let us know what part of the world you're in and what hour the clock shows for you. It creates a wonderful sense of unity to know we are all sharing this story together from every corner of the globe at every moment of the day and night. It's a small way to bridge the distance between us. Now, let's create the right atmosphere for our story to unfold. I invite you to let the ambient light in your room soften and fade, perhaps letting a gentle breeze from a fan create a subtle, whispering soundtrack. The aim is to build a tranquil space where the noise of the modern world can recede, allowing your mind to drift and relax. We are about to step into the past together, and a calm mind is the best vessel for such a contemplative journey. Let the quiet settle around you as we begin our descent into a time long since past, but whose echoes still shape our world. Let your consciousness drift and settle. You awaken not in your own time, but in a place far removed from the familiar. The year is 1347, and the world around you is that of medieval Europe. We are using this moment as our entry point, a specific year that stands on the precipice of a monumental, world-altering catastrophe. Through this immersive approach, we hope to build a more personal and intuitive understanding of the historical events that are about to transpire. This isn't just a history lesson, it's an exercise in empathy, a chance to walk in our minds through a landscape of the past, to truly grasp the significance of 1347. We must first look backward and understand the precarious state of the world you've just woken up in. This wasn't a society thriving in a golden age. On the contrary, Europe was a continent living on a knife's edge, its people already worn thin by decades of profound struggle and deprivation. The stage for the coming tragedy had been set long before the main actor arrived. The vulnerability of the population was a key factor in the devastation that would follow, a story of a society already pushed to its absolute breaking point before the real test even began. One of the most significant events that shaped this era of vulnerability was the Great Famine, a period of catastrophic hunger that swept across the continent from 1315 to 1317. This wasn't a simple bad harvest. It was a prolonged agricultural collapse that had deep and lasting consequences for the population. The memory of this immense suffering was still fresh in the minds of many, and its physical impact was even more present. The famine stands as a grim prologue to our main story, a critical piece of context that explains why society was so fragile when the plague finally made its appearance on European shores. The catalyst for this devastating famine was an anomalous and relentless shift in the climate. For years on end, Europe was besieged by torrential rains and unseasonably cold weather. Fields turned to mud, seeds rotted before they could sprout, and harvests failed completely across vast swaths of the continent. This wasn't a human failure, but a force of nature, against which medieval society had no defense. The scale of this climate event was unprecedented, triggering a domino effect that would lead to one of the most severe food crises in the continent's entire recorded history. It was a perfect storm of environmental disaster. The societal fallout from the famine was catastrophic. With food impossibly scarce, the very fabric of communities began to unravel. Starvation became a common sight in towns and villages, leading to rampant crime, social unrest, and a spike in diseases that preyed on malnourished bodies. The bonds of law and order were stretched to their breaking point as people grew more desperate. This period left a deep psychological scar on the generation that endured it, a collective trauma born from witnessing society's descent into a state of near-total chaos, where survival was the only imperative that mattered. The stark reality of this period is captured vividly in the writings of contemporary observers, such as the chronicler Johannes de Troclo. His accounts paint a harrowing picture of the era's desperation, noting that even the King of England struggled to procure bread for his own court. Such primary sources are invaluable as they transform abstract historical facts into tangible human suffering. They speak of a land so gripped by want that the normal order was completely upended. These records allow us to hear the faint, desperate echoes of the past and appreciate the true depth of the crisis that preceded the plague. The demographic cost of the Great Famine was immense, serving as a brutal culling of the European population. Modern historians estimate that in the hardest-hit regions, between 10% and 25% of the populace perished from starvation or the diseases that followed in its wake. This staggering loss of life meant that the generation facing the Black Death was not only psychologically scarred, but also physically diminished. The continent was, in a very real sense, a convalescent patient, weakened and highly susceptible to the new, even deadlier affliction that was quietly making its way from the east. Let's return to your cottage. The space you inhabit is a world away from modern notions of a home. There are no private bedrooms here. Your entire family shares a single, communal room. The structure itself is a testament to the resources at hand, built with a simple wooden frame and walls made of wattle and daub, a practical mixture of woven lattice, mud, and straw. This dwelling is humble but functional, offering a basic shield against the elements. Your life is lived in close quarters, a shared existence that is typical for the vast majority of people living in this era, where privacy is an unimaginable luxury. As you stir and your senses awaken, the air greets you with a complex tapestry of familiar medieval smells. You can detect the lingering smokiness from the central hearth, which burned through the night for warmth. Beneath that is the damp, earthy fragrance of the packed dirt floor, and woven through it all is the pungent, ever-present scent of humanity in an age before routine bathing. This olfactory landscape would be overwhelming to a modern nose, but here it is simply the unremarkable background aroma of daily life, a sensory constant for everyone, rich and poor alike. In this period, a pang of hunger reminds you of your first meal of the day. Breakfast, if you are fortunate, consists of the remains of yesterday's loaf of bread. It is dense and likely hardened overnight, requiring you to soften each bite in a bit of weak, low-alcohol ale. This practice might seem strange, But the ale is a crucial staple. Fermentation made it a much safer source of hydration than water drawn from potentially contaminated wells or streams. For this reason, nearly everyone, including children, consumed this brew daily. It was less a beverage of choice and more a fundamental component of a safe diet. Looking outside your doorway, you see the village already humming with the familiar rhythms of agrarian life. The air carries the gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture and the sharp clucking of chickens pecking in the dirt. You hear the voices of your neighbors exchanging greetings as they head out to the fields. The majority of the people here are peasants, their existence defined by the relentless cycle of agricultural labor, whether they are free tenants paying rent or serfs, legally bound to the land. Their lives are dictated by the needs of the local lord's estate and the turning of the seasons. Time in your world is measured differently. The arc of the sun across the sky dictates the length of your workday, and the chime of the church bells marks the cadence of your weeks, calling you to prayer and rest. The entire year is structured around the great cycles of planting, growth, and harvest. There is a deep and abiding predictability to this way of life. It is unquestionably a life of hardship and ceaseless labor, but it is also one of stability. The patterns are known, the rules are understood, and your place within this grand, ordered system feels secure, unchanging, and eternal. But this deep-seated sense of permanence is a fragile illusion. Unbeknownst to you and everyone you know, an unstoppable force of change is already in motion, creeping inexorably closer with each passing day. A great shadow is beginning to fall across the known world, an agent of chaos so profound that it will irrevocably shatter the predictable rhythms of your existence. The very foundations of your society are about to be tested in a way that no war, famine, or political upheaval has ever managed before. A new and terrifying chapter of history is about to begin, and your life is standing directly in its path. This creeping shadow has a name, though you do not yet know it. It is a pestilence that first emerged from the arid, windswept plains of Central Asia. For years, it has been making a slow, deadly pilgrimage westward, hitching a ride along the sprawling network of trade routes known as the Silk Road. It has moved silently from caravan to caravan, from settlement to settlement, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. This was a truly globalized phenomenon for the medieval world, a disease that exploited the very interconnectedness of human commerce to fuel its relentless and deadly expansion. The first hint of this approaching doom arrives in your village, not as a tangible threat, but as a whispered story on the lips of a traveling merchant. These traders are your village's primary link to the wider world, bringing exotic goods like silks and spices from faraway lands. They are purveyors of the rare and the wonderful. But this time, the merchant's most valuable commodity is not in his cart. It is the information he carries. He brings with him tales of a terrifying sickness that is laying waste to the great cities of the East, stories that sound more like dark fantasy than reality. The merchant's story centers on a specific place, the bustling Genos trading port of Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula of the Black Sea. In the year 1346, this vital commercial hub found itself under a prolonged and grueling siege by the formidable Mongol army. Kaffa was a critical link in the chain of trade between Europe and Asia, a vibrant crossroads of cultures and goods, but its strategic importance was about to make it the unwitting gateway for the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, the place where the plague would make its fateful leap from one continent to another. As the siege of Kaffa wore on, the besieging Mongol army was ravaged by a mysterious and deadly illness. In an act of desperation and unparalleled brutality. The Mongol commander resorted to a horrifying new form of warfare. He ordered the plague-ridden corpses of his dead soldiers to be loaded into catapults and hurled over the city's defensive walls. This gruesome barrage rained down upon the trapped inhabitants of Kaffa, seeding the city with the very pestilence that was destroying the army outside. It was a terrifyingly effective, if ghastly, act of medieval biological warfare. It is important to note that this dramatic and horrifying account of the siege originates from a single source, an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi, while his narrative has become the definitive story of the plague's entry into Europe. Many modern historians question whether he was actually present at Kaffa to witness these events himself. This detail adds a layer of complexity to the historical record. While the story powerfully illustrates the terror of the time, we must acknowledge that it exists at the intersection of factual reporting and sensational, second-hand storytelling. Regardless of the exact details of the siege, the outcome was the same. Terrified by the outbreak within their walls, Genoese merchants fled Kaffa by sea, desperate to escape the pestilence. However, their ships carried more than just sailors and cargo. In their holds were the black rats that served as hosts for the plague, and on those rats were the fleas that carried the deadly bacterium. These vessels, intended as ships of salvation for the fleeing merchants, were transformed into floating incubators of death, unknowingly carrying the pandemic out of the Black Sea and into the heart of Europe. The arrival of these ships in European ports was a scene of pure horror. The Sicilian chronicler Michelangelo di Piaser recorded that when 12 Genoese galleys docked in Messina in October of 1347, they brought with them a pestilence of unimaginable virulence. He wrote that the disease was so potent that anyone who as much as spoke to one of the sailors was seized by a mortal illness. This powerful primary source account conveys the sheer shock and terror of the plague's arrival, highlighting its frightening speed and the utter helplessness of those who first encountered its deadly power. Back in your village, the merchants' grim tales are met with a mix of reactions. The more pious among your neighbors immediately make the sign of the cross, whispering prayers for protection against this distant evil. Others, however, are more skeptical, dismissing the stories as the kind of fearful exaggerations and wild rumors that often travel along trade routes. This division reflects a deeply human response to threats that are not yet visible. It's a conflict between instinctual fear of the unknown and a rational desire to believe that such horrors could not possibly reach their quiet, isolated world. After the merchant departs, life in your village seems to return to its normal, predictable pace for a while, but the unsettling stories he brought do not fade away. Instead, they are reinforced by new whispers and rumors that arrive with each passing month. The reports become more frequent, more detailed, and more alarmingly close. The plague is no longer a distant tale from the east. It has now been confirmed in the great Mediterranean ports of Marseille and Venice. The shadow that was once on the horizon is now falling directly upon the shores of Europe, and it is moving inland with terrifying speed. The most chilling reports, which solidify the growing panic, are of so-called death ships. These are merchant vessels that drift aimlessly into European harbors, with their sails still aloft, but with no living soul at the helm. An eerie silence hangs over them, their entire crews having perished during the voyage. These ghost ships serve as undeniable, floating proof of the pestilence's ferocity. They are grim maritime coffins, offering a terrifying preview of the fate that awaits the communities on the shore. The specter of these silent arrivals transforms abstract fear into a palpable and stomach-churning dread for all who witness them. Back in the relative safety of your village, people begin to take what meager precautions they can, though their efforts are guided by instinct rather than knowledge. Some hoard what little extra grain they have, while others flock to the church, spending hours on their knees, praying for divine mercy and protection. The local healer, a woman skilled in herbal remedies, gathers plants and brews poultices, but even she works with a sense of futility. No one truly understands the nature of the enemy they are facing, so their preparations are a shot in the dark, a desperate attempt to impose some control over a situation, spiraling into chaos. The buffer of distance evaporates when news arrives that the sickness has taken hold in a neighboring village, just a half-day's journey away. The accounts from this nearby community provide the first clear clinical picture of the affliction's progression. The victims are said to suffer from a raging fever and an unquenchable thirst, but the most terrifying symptom is the appearance of dark, painful swellings the size of eggs, or even apples that erupt in their groins and armpits. From the onset of these signs, death almost invariably follows within 3 days. The disease now has a recognizable and horrifying face. The arrival of the plague so close to home forces the village elders into an urgent and fraught debate. A council is convened to decide on a course of action. One faction argues for a radical solution to completely seal off the village from all outsiders, cutting ties with the world to save themselves. Others argue that such a quarantine is impossible. Trade and travel are the lifeblood of the community, essential for supplies and news. The elders are trapped in a classic dilemma, forced to weigh the terrifying risk of contagion against the certainty of economic ruin and isolation. There is no easy answer. Ultimately, their debate is rendered moot. The plague makes its own decision. One morning, a young apprentice who works at the village mill does not show up for his duties. His absence is noted, and a friend is sent to his cottage to check on him. The boy is found drenched in a feverish sweat, his body trembling, and there, on the side of his neck, is the undeniable sign: a swollen, tender, and darkening lump. It is no longer a rumor or a distant story. In that small, dim cottage, the Black Death has officially announced its terrifying arrival in your community. The abstract threat is now intensely personal. What follows that first case is a descent into a waking nightmare. The sickness moves through the community with a speed and ferocity that defies all comprehension. It seems to leap from house to house, an invisible fire consuming the village. The grim pattern becomes sickeningly familiar. A person appears perfectly healthy at dawn, complains of a fever by noon, and is often dead before the sun rises again. The sheer velocity of its spread creates an atmosphere of complete panic and helplessness, as if the village is being besieged by a phantom army that cannot be seen, fought, or reasoned with. You quickly learn that this pestilence is not a single, uniform entity. It is a multifaceted monster that attacks its victims in several different ways. The healers and village elders identify 3 distinct manifestations of the disease, each with its own horrifying set of symptoms and its own terrifyingly high chance of death. Understanding these variations becomes a matter of grim fascination for the survivors, a way to categorize the horror that is unfolding around them. It is as if they are facing not one, but 3 separate plagues that have descended upon them all at once. The most frequent form is the one that gives the Black Death its name, the bubonic plague. This version is defined by the development of the agonizingly painful swellings, the buboes that appear on the victim's lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, or groin. These lumps are the outward sign of the body's immune system being completely overwhelmed by the infection. For those afflicted with this bubonic form, the suffering is intense. While some hardy individuals do survive, the odds are grim, with a mortality rate that hovers somewhere between 40 and 70% for those who are left untreated. A second, even more dreaded form of the disease soon appears: the pneumonic plague. In these cases, the infection settles directly in the lungs. Instead of buboes, the primary symptom is a violent, racking cough that produces bloody sputum. This variant is terrifying, not only because it is more lethal than the bubonic form, but because it can be transmitted directly from person to person through infected droplets in the air. A simple conversation or a shared breath could be a death sentence. For those who contract pneumonic plague, survival is almost unheard of. Death is swift and nearly certain. Finally, there is the third and most rapid form of the pestilence, the septicemic plague. In this manifestation, the Yersinia pestis bacteria floods the victim's bloodstream, causing a massive systemic infection. This version of the disease is so swift and overwhelming that death can occur in a matter of hours, sometimes even before the more classic symptoms like buboes have a chance to develop. The victim's skin often darkens due to widespread hemorrhaging beneath the surface, a phenomenon that may have also contributed to the name Black Death. It is the rarest, but by far the most lethal, variant of the three. Faced with a horror of this magnitude, the people of your time struggle desperately to find an explanation. The most common belief is that the plague is a form of divine retribution, a terrible punishment sent by an angry God for humanity's sins. Others subscribe to the theory of miasma, believing the disease is carried on foul, corrupted air, leading them to carry sweet-smelling flowers and herbs. And in the darkest corners of society, the fear gives way to hatred, as baseless and malicious rumors spread, accusing Jewish communities of poisoning wells and deliberately causing the pestilence. The terrible irony is that the true culprit is something entirely beyond the realm of 14th century comprehension. It is not the wrath of God or a foul vapor in the air. The Black Death is caused by a microscopic organism, a bacterium known today as Yersinia pestis. This invisible killer is the real agent of the devastation, a life form whose existence will not be discovered for another 500 years. The people of your time are fighting a biological war against an enemy they cannot see, diagnose, or even imagine, making their struggle all the more tragic and their theories all the more poignant. The transmission of this invisible enemy is a complex biological chain of events. The Yersinia pestis bacterium lives and multiplies within the digestive tracts of fleas. These infected fleas, in turn, find their primary hosts on the backs of black rats, which thrive in the bustling, crowded, and unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and villages. The rats, acting as unwitting taxis for the infected fleas, travel everywhere in the holds of ships, in merchants' carts, and through the rafters of homes, thereby delivering the agents of the plague directly to the human population. It is impossible to overstate the profound ignorance that surrounded this catastrophe. While you and your fellow villagers are living through this nightmare, you have absolutely no concept of bacteriology, disease vectors, or contagion in the modern sense. The very idea that the rats scurrying in the walls or the fleas hopping in the straw could be the source of the apocalypse would have sounded like utter madness. This complete lack of understanding is a crucial part of the terror. All you know for certain is that people are dying in droves, and there is no logical, discernible reason why. In the early days of the outbreak, the sound of the church bell is a constant, mournful companion, tolling to mark the passing of each new victim. But as the death toll accelerates, the ringing becomes incessant, a frantic, overlapping chorus of grief that hangs over the village day and night. Eventually, a new, even more terrifying silence descends. The parish priest, overwhelmed by the sheer number of funerals, or perhaps dead himself, simply stops ringing the bell. There are too many dead to announce. The silence is a chilling admission of defeat, a sign that death has become too commonplace to even mark. The devastation is not confined to your small village. It is a continental inferno. In the great city of Florence, a vibrant center of art and commerce, with a pre-plague population of over 100,000, the pestilence reduces the number of inhabitants to a mere 50,000 in just a few years. London suffers a similarly catastrophic fate, with some historical estimates suggesting that the city may have lost as much as 2/3 of its people. These numbers are almost too large to comprehend, representing a level of mortality that would be unimaginable in the modern world. Zooming out to a continental scale, the statistics become even more staggering. Modern demographers and historians, while debating the precise figures, generally agree that the initial waves of the Black Death wiped out somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's entire population. It was an unparalleled demographic collapse, a catastrophic event that killed more people and a higher percentage of the population than any war, famine, or other disaster in recorded history. In just a handful of years, the pestilence fundamentally and permanently redrew the human map of the continent. The sheer volume of corpses completely overwhelms the traditional customs and rituals of death. The solemn, individual funerals that once honored a person's passing are now an impossible luxury. Instead, bodies are hastily collected from homes, sometimes by family members, other times by designated cart drivers. They are piled high and transported to the edge of the village, where they are unceremoniously deposited into enormous mass graves or plague pits. These pits are a pragmatic necessity, but they also represent a profound psychological trauma, the final, anonymous indignity for the victims. The raw, personal agony of this experience is captured in the chronicle of a Sienese man named Agnolo di Tura. His words cut through the centuries with devastating clarity, describing the pits filled with the dead and the abandonment of all ceremony. "And I," he wrote, "Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands." This single, heartbreaking sentence transforms abstract history into a visceral, human tragedy. It is the voice of one man trying to process an unthinkable loss, a testament to the private grief that was multiplied by millions across the suffering continent. This constant proximity to death causes the very bonds of society to fray and snap. Fear becomes the dominant emotion, overriding even the most fundamental human connections of family and community. People who are still healthy bar their doors, refusing entry to neighbors, friends, and even sick relatives. Some parents are said to have abandoned their own ailing children. Others flee their homes and villages entirely, hoping to outrun the invisible enemy. It is a time of profound social disintegration, where the instinct for self-preservation eclipses all other duties and affections. In this atmosphere of terror and divine abandonment, some people turn to extreme acts of religious devotion. The most dramatic example of this is the flagellant movement. These are groups of penitents who travel from town to town, marching in processions and publicly whipping themselves with leather scourges, often tipped with iron. They believe that by performing this act of extreme, bloody penance, they can atone for the sins of humanity and persuade God to lift the terrible punishment of the plague. Their public displays of piety are a startling and desperate response to the overwhelming crisis. The institutional church, which should have been a source of stability and comfort, is itself thrown into chaos. Priests are expected to be on the front lines, administering last rites to the dying, and presiding over burials. This sacred duty places them in constant contact with the sick, and as a result, they die at an alarmingly high rate. Many, overcome by fear, abandon their parishes and flee for their own safety. This leaves countless communities without spiritual leadership at the moment of their greatest need, severely damaging the prestige and authority of the church in the eyes of the terrified populace. The abstract horror of the plague is about to become an intimate reality for your family. For weeks, you have lived in a state of suspended fear, lucky to have been spared, while neighbors on all sides have fallen ill. But in a world where the pestilence rages so fiercely, such luck is a fragile and temporary thing. One evening, your younger brother, who had been playing outside just that morning, begins to complain of a deep chill and a profound weariness. It is the subtle, dreaded beginning of the sickness, and a cold knot of fear tightens in your stomach as you realize the plague has finally crossed your threshold. Your family immediately springs into a desperate, practiced routine of care. Your mother tends to your brother constantly, cooling his feverish skin with damp cloths, and trying to coax him to take small sips of water or weak ale. Your father discusses the possibility of seeking help from the monks at the local monastery, but it's a futile thought. Everyone knows the monasteries are overwhelmed, functioning more as hospices than places of healing. You all know, deep down, that there is little you can do but watch and wait as the disease takes its inexorable course through his small body. For 3 agonizing days, your brother's condition deteriorates. He becomes delirious with fever, crying out in pain as the telltale bubo on his neck grows more swollen and angry. His breathing becomes shallow and labored. This is the stage where most victims succumb to the illness. But then, on the morning of the 4th day, the seemingly impossible happens. His fever suddenly breaks. The bubo, instead of hardening, softens and begins to drain a foul-smelling fluid. He is exhausted, weak, and barely able to speak, but he is alive. Against all odds and expectations, he is going to be one of the few, the very few, to survive. Of course, you and your family can only interpret this incredible recovery as a miracle, a direct intervention from a merciful God. You have no way of knowing the true biological reason for your brother's survival. It is a secret hidden deep within his very blood, a microscopic quirk of his genetic makeup. Modern science would eventually uncover this secret, identifying a specific gene mutation known as CCR5 delta 32. This tiny variation in his DNA, a random fluke of inheritance, had equipped his body with a powerful, innate defense against the ravages of the pestilence that had claimed so many others around him. The protective power of this genetic mutation lies in how it alters the very surface of a person's immune cells. The CCR5 protein acts as a kind of doorway, a receptor that certain pathogens, including the plague bacterium, can use to gain entry into and hijack the body's defensive cells. The delta 32 mutation effectively changes the lock on this doorway, making it much more difficult, if not impossible, for the plague to invade and replicate. It's a subtle but profound biological advantage, a genetic shield that rendered some individuals naturally resistant to the deadliest disease of their time. The origins of this remarkable mutation are a subject of ongoing scientific discussion. For many years, it was believed that the Black Death itself was the powerful selective event that made this gene more common among Europeans, a brutal case of survival of the fittest on a continental scale. However, more recent research suggests the mutation may be much older, perhaps having been selected for by an even earlier disease, like smallpox. This debate highlights how science constantly refines our understanding of the past, revealing a complex history of disease and adaptation written in our DNA. One of the most astonishing discoveries about this medieval genetic legacy is its relevance to a modern pandemic. Centuries after the Black Death, scientists found that the very same CCR5 delta 32 mutation that conferred resistance to the plague also provides significant protection against HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. In a stunning twist of biological fate, the same genetic quirk that saved some of your ancestors from the pestilence of the 14th century would continue to protect their distant descendants from one of the most significant viral threats of the 20th and 21st centuries. You see anecdotal evidence of this strange immunity all around you, though you interpret it through a medieval lens. There's the village gravedigger, a man who handles the plague-ridden dead every day, yet never falls ill himself, or the local midwife who tends to sick and dying mothers, but remains inexplicably healthy. The villagers whisper that their survival is due to some form of divine protection, or perhaps, in the case of the unsavory gravedigger, a dark pact with the devil. The idea of a hidden biological advantage is simply not a part of their conceptual world. Their survival remains a profound and unsettling mystery. While the human cost of the plague is immeasurable, its immediate economic impact is stark and undeniable. With so many people dead or dying, the basic functions of the village grind to a halt. Fields lie fallow, their crops unharvested and rotting on the stalk. The mill is silent, the blacksmith's forge is cold. The scarcity of labor and the disruption of trade routes cause the price of essential goods like grain and salt to skyrocket, while the value of land, now plentiful, plummets. The plague triggers not just a health crisis, but a complete and catastrophic economic collapse that touches every survivor. As the first cold winds of winter begin to blow, a fragile sense of hope returns to the village. The rate of new infections slows, and it seems the pestilence might be receding. This lull, however, is a cruel deception. It is not the result of any human effort, but is tied to the life cycle of the fleas and rats, which are less active in the cold. The Black Death has not been defeated. It has merely entered a period of dormancy. With the return of warmth and life, in the spring, the disease will reawaken with renewed virulence, launching subsequent waves of death upon the terrified and exhausted survivors. This brutal cycle of outbreak and remission continues for 4 terrifying years, between 1347 and 1351. These successive waves of pestilence complete their initial, devastating sweep across the continent of Europe. In this short span of time, a staggering number of people, estimated by modern historians to be between 75 and 200 million, are wiped from existence. It is a demographic shock of unimaginable proportions, a reaping of humanity so vast that it fundamentally alters the course of history and leaves a permanent scar on the collective memory of the Western world. The world that emerges from this crucible of death is a profoundly empty one. The most immediate and transformative consequence of this massive population decline is a severe and unprecedented shortage of labor. In every town and village, there are simply not enough living people left to perform the essential tasks of society. There are not enough farmers to till the fields, not enough artisans to craft goods, and not enough builders to maintain structures. This new reality completely upends the old economic order, shifting the balance of power in a way that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. For the peasants and laborers who survived, this new, emptier world presents an unexpected opportunity. With workers now a scarce and valuable commodity, their wages begin to climb at a dizzying rate. A farmhand or a reaper who was once paid a pittance can now demand several times their pre-plague wage and get it. For the first time in centuries, the common laborer has significant economic leverage. This sudden financial empowerment plants the seeds of a social revolution, giving the lowest classes of society a newfound sense of their own value and power that cannot be easily contained. The traditional ruling class, the nobility and wealthy landowners, reacts to this economic shift with alarm and indignation. They see their power and profits eroding as the cost of labor soars. In an attempt to turn back the clock and restore the old economic order, they turn to the power of the law. In England, for example, the Crown issues the Statute of Labourers in 1351. This royal decree attempts to cap wages at their pre-plague levels, making it illegal for peasants to demand more and for lords to offer more. It is a desperate attempt to legislate away the new reality. Despite the threat of fines and punishments, these attempts to control wages are almost entirely feudal. The economic laws of supply and demand prove to be far more powerful than any royal decree. With so much land available and so few hands to work it, landowners are desperate for laborers and are willing to pay high wages in secret to keep their estates from falling into ruin. The peasants, aware of their own value, simply refuse to work for the old rates, often abandoning their manors to seek out better opportunities elsewhere. The Statute of Laborers becomes a widely ignored and unenforceable piece of legislation. This growing tension between a newly empowered peasantry and a reactionary nobility creates a volatile social powder keg. The old feudal certainties have been shattered, and a new, more contentious relationship is forming between the classes. This period of friction and resentment eventually erupts into open and violent conflict. Across Europe, the decades following the Black Death are marked by a series of major peasant uprisings as the common people rise up to challenge the authority of their lords and demand a permanent end to the oppressive structures of the past. Two of the most significant of these post-plague rebellions occur in France and England. In 1358, the French peasantry explodes in a violent, spontaneous uprising known as the Jacquerie, where they attack castles and slaughter nobles. 2 decades later, in 1381, England is rocked by the Peasants' Revolt, a more organized insurrection led by figures like Wat Tyler. Tens of thousands of rebels march on London, demanding radical changes, including the complete abolition of serfdom. Both revolts are direct consequences of the new social dynamics created by the plague. In the end, both the Jacquerie and the English Peasants' Revolt are crushed with brutal force by the ruling establishment. Their leaders are executed and their armies are scattered. In the short term, the uprisings are failures. However, they serve as a powerful and terrifying demonstration of the peasantry's newfound resolve. The memory of these massive rebellions lingers, and they mark a crucial turning point. They accelerate the decline of serfdom in Western Europe as lords gradually realize that the old systems of forced labor are no longer sustainable in the post-plague world. The authority of the Church, once an unassailable pillar of medieval society, is also severely damaged by the plague. The institution's inability to provide any meaningful explanation for the catastrophe beyond tired refrains of divine punishment leads to a crisis of faith for many survivors. They question why their prayers went unanswered, and why the clergy seemed just as powerless and terrified as everyone else. The high death rate among priests and the fact that many abandon their flocks further erodes the moral authority and prestige of the church in the eyes of the common person. Just as the plague shook the foundations of faith, it also delivered a devastating blow to the credibility of medieval medicine. The established medical knowledge of the time, based largely on the ancient Greek theories of humors and the mistaken idea of miasma, proved utterly useless against the pestilence. Physicians who prescribed treatments like bloodletting, herbal remedies, and complex dietary restrictions saw their patients die at the same rate as those who received no treatment at all. This catastrophic failure exposed the deep ignorance of the medical establishment, creating an opening for new, more empirical approaches to science. For every survivor, the world has been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The psychological landscape is just as transformed as the economic and social ones. They are haunted by the memory of unimaginable loss, but they are also inheritors of a world brimming with strange new opportunities. The rigid hierarchies and certainties of the pre-plague era have been shattered, leaving behind a more fluid, chaotic, and dynamic society. The survivors stand at a pivotal moment in history, tasked with the monumental challenge of building a new world upon the ashes and bones of the old one. Let us now leap forward in time, leaving the 14th century behind. Our journey takes us 3 centuries ahead to the year 1665. We find ourselves in the small, isolated village of Iam, nestled among the rolling limestone hills of Derbyshire in England. This peaceful community, with a population of around 700 to 800 people, makes its living primarily from farming and lead mining. The Great Plague of the medieval era is a distant historical memory, but the same deadly pathogen, Yersinia pestis, is about to make a terrifying reappearance in this unsuspecting and secluded village. The plague does not arrive in Iam with a horde of rats or a dramatic siege. It arrives quietly, hidden within an innocuous-looking bundle of cloth. A local tailor orders the fabric from London, which is currently in the grip of its own major plague outbreak. The bolt of cloth is damp when it arrives, and the tailor's assistant, George Vickers, dutifully hangs it by the fire to dry. In doing so, he unknowingly awakens the dormant fleas nestled within the fabric, and within days, he becomes the first person in Iam to die from the Great Plague. The pestilence has been delivered by mail. As the disease begins to spread from the tailor's house to the surrounding families, panic takes hold of the village. It is at this critical juncture that 2 remarkable local leaders step forward to propose a radical and courageous plan. The village's newly appointed rector, William Mompesson, and the former rector, a Puritan minister named Thomas Stanley, managed to set aside their own significant religious disagreements. They form a unified front to address the crisis, understanding that communal survival depends on their ability to work together and inspire trust. Their proposal is both heroic and horrifying. They argue that the villagers of Iam must make an extraordinary sacrifice to prevent the plague from spreading to the nearby city of Sheffield and the surrounding countryside. They ask the entire community to agree to a voluntary quarantine, to completely seal themselves off from the outside world. This means no one can leave the village until the disease has run its course, effectively condemning themselves to live and die alongside the pestilence. In order to save the lives of thousands of strangers in the region. Amazingly, the villagers agree to this incredible act of self-sacrifice. The quarantine is put into effect, with strict rules governing daily life. Church services are moved outdoors, to a natural amphitheater in a nearby dell called Cucklet Church to allow for social distancing. A boundary is marked by stones around the village, which no one is allowed to cross. Food and supplies are left at these boundary stones by people from neighboring communities who exchange them for money, left soaking in vinegar, which was believed to kill the contagion. Life in Ayam becomes a communal prison. The quarantine lasts for a grueling 14 months. During that time, the plague burns its way through the trapped community with devastating efficiency. By the time the last victim dies, in November of 1666, the final death toll is staggering. Of the roughly 700 to 800 souls living in Ayam, when the outbreak began, at least 260 are dead. The mortality rate is far higher than that experienced in London during the same outbreak. The village is left a hollowed-out shell, with entire family lines completely extinguished, and a profound sense of communal grief hanging over the survivors. The scale of this tragedy is best understood through the stories of individual loss. One of the most heart-wrenching accounts is that of a woman named Elizabeth Hancock. Over the course of just 8 days in August of 1666, she watched in horror as the plague claimed the lives of her 6 children and her husband. Because no one else dared to help her for fear of contagion, she was forced to drag the bodies of her entire family, one by one, up the hill to a small plot of land and bury them all with her own hands. Her story puts a deeply personal and unforgettable face on the statistical horror of the Ayam plague. Another poignant tragedy that unfolded during the quarantine was the story of 2 young lovers, Emot Sidal and Roland Tora. As Emot's family was afflicted by the plague, the couple was forbidden from meeting face to face. Instead, they would arrange clandestine meetings at a distance, calling out to each other across a small, secluded valley that separated their homes. This heartbreaking ritual continued until one day, Roland arrived at their meeting spot to find only silence. Emot had succumbed to the disease, their love story cut short by the cruel reality of the quarantine they had both agreed to honor. Despite the immense personal cost and the staggering loss of life, the heroic sacrifice of the Ayam villagers ultimately achieved its goal. Their self-imposed imprisonment was a resounding success from a public health standpoint. The plague was effectively contained within the village's boundaries, burning itself out without spreading to the major population centers of the region. The story of Ayam is therefore remembered not just as a tragedy, but as one of history's most extraordinary examples of civic duty and altruistic self-sacrifice, where an entire community chose to perish in order to protect the lives of countless others. The profound trauma of the Black Death left an indelible mark on the European psyche, which manifested powerfully in the art of the period. In the decades following the plague, a new and morbid artistic theme emerged, becoming an obsession across the continent. It was known as the dance macabre, or the dance of death. This artistic motif was a direct cultural response to the overwhelming presence of mortality in daily life. It was a way for artists and society at large to process, comprehend, and express their anxieties about the fragility of life in a world that had been turned upside down by the pestilence. The imagery of the dance macabre was consistent and chillingly direct. It typically depicted animated skeletons, personifications of death itself, leading a procession of living individuals to their graves. Crucially, this procession included people from every station of society. A pope, an emperor, a knight, a merchant, and a humble peasant would all be shown dancing together in death's embrace. The message was unmistakable and deeply subversive for the time. Death is the ultimate leveler, an indiscriminate force that pays no heed to wealth, power, or piety. In the face of mortality, all of humanity is equal. When we think of this era, a very specific and powerful image often comes to mind. The plague doctor, clad in a long coat and a peculiar beaked mask. This figure has become an iconic symbol of the Black Death. However, this popular image is historically inaccurate. The beaked costume was not actually invented until the 17th century, meaning it was a feature of later plague outbreaks, like the one in Ayam, but it was completely absent during the great medieval pandemic of the 1300. The physicians of the original Black Death faced the horror with far less protection and a very different appearance. The famous beaked mask, while visually terrifying, was designed with a specific medical theory in mind. The long, bird-like beak was not for show. It was a hollow chamber, designed to be filled with aromatic and pungent materials. These included things like dried flowers, herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked sponges. The purpose of this potpourri was to filter the air that the doctor breathed, protecting them from the miasma, or corrupted air, that was believed to be the cause of the disease. The costume was, in essence, a personal, mobile air filter, based on a completely flawed understanding of how the plague actually spread. The aftermath of the Black Death did not create a uniform new reality across Europe. The long-term social and economic consequences of the pandemic played out very differently in the western and eastern parts of the continent. While the demographic collapse acted as a catalyst for profound change everywhere, the specific nature of that change was heavily influenced by the pre-existing political and economic structures in each region. The plague's legacy was therefore a divided one, setting the two halves of Europe on dramatically divergent historical paths that would shape their development for centuries to come. In Western European nations, like England and France, the severe labor shortage created by the plague ultimately led to the empowerment of the peasantry and the unraveling of the old feudal system. With land plentiful and workers scarce, serfs could abandon their manors and demand higher wages as free laborers. This newfound economic freedom, combined with the social unrest of the peasant revolts, gradually eroded the foundations of serfdom. The plague, in this context, acted as an agent of liberation, accelerating the transition towards a more modern, wage-based economy and greater personal freedom for the common person. In stark contrast, the opposite occurred in Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and Russia. Here, the landowning nobility was more powerful and politically organized than in the West. In response to the labor shortage, these elites used their power not to negotiate, but to impose even stricter laws that bound peasants more tightly to the land. This phenomenon, known as the Second Serfdom, meant that while Western peasants were gaining freedom, their Eastern counterparts were being pushed into an even more oppressive and entrenched state of servitude. The plague's shock created two very different futures. To better understand the unique historical footprint of the Black Death, it is helpful to compare it to other major pandemics. The 1918 Spanish flu, for example, which swept the globe in the wake of World War I, offers a powerful point of comparison. Like the plague, it was a global catastrophe that caused massive social disruption and fear. However, the nature of the pathogen, an influenza virus, rather than a bacterium, and the state of the world in the 20th century, meant that its transmission, mortality profile, and ultimate societal impact were significantly different from the medieval pestilence. The Spanish flu was terrifyingly contagious, spreading with incredible speed through a world connected by modern transport like trains and steamships. It killed an estimated 20 to 40 million people, a staggering number. However, its overall case fatality rate was significantly lower than that of the Black Death. While the plague killed a third or more of everyone it infected, the Spanish flu was lethal for a smaller percentage of its victims. This distinction is crucial. The plague was a far deadlier disease on a per-person basis, which helps explain its more profoundly transformative effect on medieval society. Drawing a line to our own time, the COVID-19 pandemic further illuminates the unique horror of the Black Death. While COVID-19 caused immense global disruption and tragedy, our response was armed with the tools of modern science. We had an understanding of germ theory, the ability to sequence a viral genome in days, and the capacity to develop vaccines in under a year. This scientific arsenal stands in stark, humbling contrast to the 14th century, where people faced a much deadlier pathogen with no effective treatments, no understanding of its cause, and no recourse beyond prayer and superstition. Beyond the tangible economic and social changes, it is crucial to consider the deep psychological wounds inflicted by the Black Death. Living through a period where death was a constant, arbitrary, and inescapable presence left a lasting trauma on the European psyche. This experience fostered a new, pervasive sense of anxiety and a morbid fascination with mortality. It fundamentally altered attitudes towards life, religion, and fate, creating a cultural climate that was more cynical, more individualistic, and more acutely aware of the fragility of human existence than the one that had preceded it. Interestingly, some modern scholars and scientists have begun to question the long-held consensus that Yersinia pestis was the sole agent responsible for the Black Death. This ongoing academic debate adds a fascinating layer of intellectual honesty to our understanding of the pandemic. These researchers point to certain inconsistencies between the symptoms described in medieval accounts and the classic presentation of bubonic plague. Today, they also question whether a rat-hand flea-based disease could have spread so rapidly through the colder parts of Europe. The alternative theories proposed by these researchers are varied. Some suggest that the medieval strain of Yersinia pestis was far more virulent or had a different mode of transmission than the modern version. Others propose that a second, unknown pathogen, perhaps a viral hemorrhagic fever, may have been working in concert with the plague bacterium, creating a synergistic superplague that was responsible for the exceptionally high mortality rate. This debate reminds us that history is not a settled story, but a field of active and ongoing investigation. Paradoxically, some historians have argued that this unparalleled catastrophe may have played a crucial role in clearing the ground for one of Western civilization's greatest cultural flowerings, the Renaissance. By shattering old institutions, redistributing wealth on a massive scale, and disrupting the rigid social hierarchies of the Middle Ages, the Black Death may have inadvertently created the conditions necessary for a cultural and intellectual rebirth. The immense shock to the system, they argue, broke the continent out of its medieval stasis and set it on a new, more dynamic path. This potential connection to the Renaissance is partly rooted in a psychological shift. The raw, overwhelming experience of the plague may have forced a change in focus for many survivors, with the promise of salvation in the afterlife seeming less certain, and the structures of the church weakened. There was a growing turn towards the concerns of the present mortal world. This renewed focus on human experience, achievement, and potential, the core tenet of humanism, was a foundational element of the Renaissance, suggesting a link between the trauma of the plague and the subsequent celebration of human life. On an economic level, some scholars point to the little divergence, a theory suggesting the plague set different parts of Europe on starkly different financial trajectories. The theory posits that the demographic changes in northwestern Europe, with its higher wages and lower rents, created a high-wage, high-innovation economy that ultimately led to the Industrial Revolution. In contrast, Southern Europe, with different institutional responses, did not experience the same economic takeoff. The plague, in this view, was a critical juncture that helped determine who would lead the world economy for the next 500 years. The memory of the plague was literally carved into the landscape of Europe. In the centuries that followed, grateful survivors and their descendants erected physical memorials to commemorate their deliverance from the pestilence. Ornate plague columns, known as pestceilen, were built in the center of many Central European towns. Entire churches were constructed and dedicated to saints who were believed to offer protection from disease. Like Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, these structures stand today as lasting physical testaments to the trauma of the plague and the enduring human need to remember and make sense of catastrophe. As we draw our journey to a close, it becomes clear that the Black Death was far more than just a historical tragedy. It was arguably the single most significant agent of change in the second millennium, a biological event that completely reshaped the religious, social, and economic landscape of Europe. It acted as a grim and violent catalyst, accelerating processes of change that might have otherwise taken centuries to unfold. The world was fundamentally and permanently remade in its wake, and the echoes of that transformation are still detectable today. Yet, for all the immense destruction and despair, the story of the Black Death is also, paradoxically, a story of human resilience. It is a stark testament to the remarkable capacity of societies to endure the unimaginable, to absorb a shock of catastrophic proportions, and to not only survive, but to eventually rebuild and adapt. The survivors, faced with a hollowed-out world, did not simply give up. They created new art, forged new social contracts, and laid the foundations for a world that would, in time, become our own. It is a powerful story of endurance against all odds. And so, we return to the quiet, contemplative space we created at the beginning of our narrative. The epic tale of death and rebirth, of microscopic organisms and continental change, now recedes. Let the details settle, and the grand sweep of history soften into the background. The purpose of this journey was not to overwhelm, but to offer a space for reflection, to connect with a distant past in a way that feels personal and meaningful. Let the echoes of the story fade, leaving behind a sense of quiet understanding and perhaps a new appreciation for the world we inhabit. Let us end with a final, powerful image. Picture yourself as one of those survivors, standing in the quiet twilight of a post-plague evening. The world is quieter now, emptier. The grief is immense, but you are alive. As you gaze up at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, you are standing at the dawn of a new and uncertain era. You cannot possibly know what the future holds, only that the world you once knew is gone forever, and you are one of the few who has been chosen to build the next one. You are a living bridge between two different worlds. The only sounds that break the profound stillness are the gentle whisper of a night breeze, rustling the leaves in the trees, and the distant bark of a dog. The rhythm of your own slow, steady breathing becomes a quiet anchor in the vast silence, left behind by the departed. After so much chaos, so much noise, and so much grief, there is a deep and abiding peace in this simple moment of survival. It is the sound of life, quiet but persistent, beginning to reclaim a world that had been surrendered to death. The great fever of the plague has finally broken, and in that quiet moment lies the most essential truth of this entire story. Despite the scale of the catastrophe, despite the collapse of institutions, and the loss of half a continent's people, life finds a way to continue. The human capacity to endure, to adapt, to grieve, and ultimately to carry on is perhaps the most powerful force in our history. The story of the Black Death is not just about how people died. It is, more importantly, about how the survivors, against all odds, chose to live. And in that choice, our modern world was born.